I remember going to see the movie Passengers in theaters. I'd seen the trailer and I was excited by it. I was intrigued by the premise. And so I went into this movie theater with high hopes. And I left kind of, I didn't find the movie all that interesting. I didn't find it all that compelling. There were some places where it was a little bit boring. It was a real letdown. But I didn't really understand why I felt that way until I stumbled across a YouTube video by the nerd writer called Passengers Rearranged, where he suggested that Passengers would be a lot more interesting if you shifted it around and rearranged the movie so that it was edited a little bit differently. I was intrigued, and so I went and I tried that edit that the nerd writer had suggested, and it did make the movie better, but it was still, it had some real weaknesses. And so I took another shot at it. I did a far more complex edit. And what I stumbled upon was a version of Passengers that actually lives up to the trailer. It's a version of Passengers that's interesting and engaging. It presents a science fiction premise and a great relational story and interweaves them. I was able to do this without changing the story itself, but simply by editing the existing material into a new order so that the story was told differently. If you've never seen Passengers, I want to start by saying this video is going to be full of spoilers. So if you want to see Passengers unspoiled, I would encourage you to go do so. I would encourage you to go watch the Nerd Writer video. It is a really great plot summary. It also introduces this concept of how you could rearrange the movie and presents a couple of alternatives about how you could rearrange it. And it's a great introduction to what I'm about to say here. But come on back when you're done. To understand Passengers, let's lay it out, all three of its acts, and let's summarize its key features. The first act of the movie is Jim alone on board the ship. So Jim wakes, he experiences loneliness, eventually going to despair. He then decides to wake Aurora. Now, that takes us into our second act. The second act is the romance story between Jim and Aurora. So Aurora wakes, they fall in love, then there's the revelation and her quite justifiable anger. That's Act 2. Then we have what Nerd Writer calls the malfunction MacGuffin. Act 3 is the ship falling apart and how they fix it. So now Gus wakes up. Then there's exposition about what exactly is going on. They fix the ship. And then there's an epilogue. That's where Aurora eventually forgives Jim. So this is the structure of the movie. This is all, of course, in chronological order in the original movie. What Nerd Writer suggested was that you should swap these first two acts. And you can do that. You can take it from Aurora's perspective. And so the first act is Aurora and Jim falling in love. There's some sort of a hint that Jim might have a secret that's not been revealed, but we don't know what it is. And then we have Jim alone. And then we have, well, Nerd Writer didn't know what to do here. This does work better than the original movie. It is an improvement over it, although it's not a gigantic improvement. This adds new dramatic tension here, because in the original version of the movie, you know that Jim woke up Aurora. And now you're simply waiting for Aurora to find that out. In this version of the movie, you know that something has happened, but you don't know what it is yet. You don't know whether to see Jim as good or bad. And okay, it kind of works. But you still have this fundamental problem. You see, Passengers has a really serious problem. And that problem is centered on the third act. The third act doesn't fit the rest of the movie. The whole rest of the movie is a science fiction movie where the people are exploring this ship, they're learning how to live in this ship. It's very relationally driven, and then everything comes to a halt. And all of a sudden it turns into an adventure movie where the characters are running around and they're always doing things, and there's the next crisis that's about to make the ship explode, and they have to fix the problem. The tone of the third act doesn't match the tone of the entire rest of the film. And so Nerdwriter suggested, well, we could just cut it off. We could just get rid of it and we end it right here. We either end it in the original ordering here, or maybe we do the flashback but end again without the third act. And while that fixes the tone problem, it introduces new types of problems. First of all, this movie is fundamentally a tragedy if we end here. Because what we have is our protagonist, who is Jim, or to a lesser extent, Aurora. And we have a lot of sympathy for them. We want things to go well for them. But instead, what happens is that the world comes crashing down and burns. And it burns fundamentally because of Jim's moral flaw. And that is the classic structure of a tragedy, is that you have a protagonist with a moral flaw. That moral flaw causes destruction, and we end in destruction. Okay, you could do that, but it's a different movie. The movie makers wanted this to be a happy movie. They wanted it to have a happy ending. It's a movie fundamentally about grace and forgiveness. And so we want Aurora to forgive him. The problem is, if you just simply tack on right here, forgive, it doesn't make any sense. Because at this point in the storytelling, what we've just encountered is the depth and the magnitude of the evil thing that Jim has done. And to immediately for Aurora to go and say, oh, never mind, I forgive you, doesn't make any sense. And you could try to fast forward 1 or 2 years and say, eventually he forgave her. And okay, yeah, maybe theoretically she might eventually. But in a storytelling sense, if you don't show the process by which she comes to the understanding that she wants to forgive him, it's not going to work. Moreover, we have a structural problem with the world, because we know that something went wrong with the ship. We don't know what it is. If you simply cut the movie right here and you say, okay, and then the ship was wonderful, all your viewers are going to walk away saying, well, if the ship failed once, isn't it going to fail again? And so you really have to address the question of why did the ship fail and how did they fix it? And again, you could drop Gus in here and you could give Gus like 5 minutes to fix the ship, but it wouldn't be satisfying. It wouldn't be believable. It would feel as tacked on as it was. So although this third act doesn't fit the movie, I think it is critical to the conclusion of the movie. I don't think that you can remove it without completely redefining what the movie is. Okay, so how are we going to fix this? Well, I did try the original version that the Nerdwriter suggested, which is just move Act 1 into the slot where Act 2 was. So romance, then Jim alone, then fix the ship. It didn't work. Again, we still had this tonal problem, and it was 40 minutes of like, why do I have to sit through this? It doesn't fit in the whole rest of the movie. What I realized was that what I needed to do was I needed to take this and to move it into the rest of the movie as much as I could so that I could unite it with the rest of the movie and not have it feel like it's this terrible tag at the end. And then I started playing with that and I started realizing, well, I could move not just this, but I could move all of the pieces of the movie around. and I could mix them in a way that would really, really improve the structure of the movie. To show you what I'm doing, I want to take a moment here and talk about the structure of the movie as it exists. Because the key revelation that I had when I was trying to figure out how I was going to re-edit this movie was that this is not one movie. This movie is 3 short stories in the same universe. Follow me here. In the first short story, Jim wakes up. He comes to a crisis of despair. He decides he's going to wake up Aurora. He thinks about it for a while. He eventually wakes her up, and then he feels guilt. Okay, well, that's a decent 30-minute movie. It's a little bit of a sad one, but okay, it works. Now what we have, movie 2, is 2 people are stuck alone in a ship. One of them has been stuck longer, but fundamentally it's a movie about 2 people. They fall in love. They have their happy peak, and then it's revealed that Jim woke up Aurora, and so we have the crisis of the relationship. The relationship falls apart. And so this is the structure of the second story. The structure of the third story is there are 3 people in a ship. They explore to figure out what's going on. One of them dies, but the other 2 continue on. They eventually fix the ship. One of them nearly dies in the process, but the 2 survive, and then they have an epilogue. The reason that this movie doesn't work at an emotional level is because it has 3 small peaks instead of 1 larger peak. So here's what I'm going to try to do. I want to build a new structure of the movie that looks like this. Slow, gradual, rising action. Comes to a peak in the third act, and eventually comes down. How am I going to get that done? Well, the way you get that done is by taking little pieces of the various stories and playing them out. So the first trick, you start with Jim. This first part of the movie is an excellent place to start because it has all of the structural exposition. What sort of a ship are they on? Why can they not go back to sleep? All that sort of stuff. And so you can establish that Jim is in a terrible place. Set up the basic rules of the world. You then immediately cut to Aurora waking up. So now you've jumped from here up to here. And you see the first few minutes of Jim and Aurora discovering their situation together. Late in that first day, Jim reveals to Aurora that he's been awake for a year. What the audience realizes is that there was a time jump in here that's not in the movie. It's a little bit disorienting. I think if this was a movie that I was making from scratch, and I had, I could do reshoots, or if I could actually cut from the original material, maybe I could make it a little bit more gentle. Right now, this is a little bit of a rough jump, but you can make it work. And so what you've now done is you've established a couple of different timelines. Now, the trick here is now you jump back into Jim's story. This is why the subtitle of this video is Thank God for the Beard. Because it turns out that as Jim is going deeper and deeper into despair, his beard gets longer and longer. And so, like on the other hand, when Jim is moving along, falling more and more in love, he's always clean shaven. And so what you can do now is you can jump back and forth between the 2 timelines, compare and contrasting different events. You're watching, on the one hand, Jim fall in love, and so you've got a rising well of happy emotion, while you're also seeing Jim fall into despair and self-destruction. And so in an emotional sense, it's all moving up. But in terms of the actual feeling, what happens is that positive emotion starts diverging from negative emotion, and the gulf between them starts to become very, very wide. In the middle of this process, you can actually introduce Gus. And so Gus wakes up while we're still weaving back and forth here. And so what we actually have is temporarily here, we're going to have 3 different timelines running parallel. It's not always completely clear when you do a jump from one to the other where you are. If you see Gus, or if you see something that looks like it's on fire, you know that you're in the 3rd act. If you see Jim with a big beard, you know you're in the 1st act. If you see Jim happy, you're in the 2nd act. But it's not always entirely clear, but it's not always necessary to have 100% clarity right from the beginning about what's going on. It turns out it works out pretty well. Key here is that you're going to hit several peaks right close to each other. The first peak that you hit is the peak of Jim's despair. Jim tries to commit suicide and chickens out at the very last moment. There's a great scene where he goes running away from the airlock and slips and falls, and you leave him there on the floor. You can jump from there right into the 2nd act, where they're in the heart of their falling in love. Jim's about to propose, and it's revealed what happened. Once this revelation takes place, then you can jump to the 3rd act. Because one of the things that's critical about this movie, one of the things that Gus provides that's not immediately obvious, is that Gus is actually the person who speaks the theme of the movie. He's, in some ways, the author surrogate.
All this time, I'm thinking you're one lucky son of a bitch that gets stuck with Aurora. It wasn't luck, was it?
No.
She knows.
She knows.
How long were you alone?
A year.
Still. Damn.
What Gus says to Jim is, what you did is wrong, and there's no excuse for it. And what Gus says to Aurora is, what he did is wrong, and there's no excuse for it. And
You're right, Aurora. But the drowning man will always try and drag somebody down with him. It ain't right, but the man's drowning.
And the cool thing is that now you can have pieces. We've got the motivation, we've got the consequences, we've got the theme that forgiveness is possible. We can draw them all together so that they're all interacting with each other. And I don't remember exactly the sequence, but there's some of this and some of that and some more of this as we're moving along. The other thing that you can do is that there's another critical juxtaposition. See, it turns out right at the end of Act 2, there's a very critical scene for Aurora. Aurora is watching a recording of her friends back on Earth, a message that they left for her. There's a great quote from her friend who says, "I hope that you open your heart and that you let someone in." Now, in the literal sense, this is happening at the end of Act 2. She is burned out with the anger that she's experienced for Jim. She's not ready to forgive him at all. But by the end of Act 3, they've gone through enough that it's now, in a storytelling sense, it's plausible to believe that she could be thinking about wanting to forgive him. Well, in the original movie, these 2 points are separated by 30 minutes. But in my cut of the movie, they're separated by 3 minutes. In my interpretation of the movie, the cusp of the entire movie, the climax of it all, is when Aurora says this.
Jim? Jim? Come back to me. I can't live on this ship without you.
Now, this is very, very critical in her progression as a character, because she's coming to realize that she does still love him. But you'll notice that there's still ambiguity in what she said. What she said is,
I can't live on this ship without you.
now, there's 2 possible ways you could interpret that. Does that mean that she doesn't want to live alone? That she's just back in despair like Jim was, and she doesn't want to be alone? Or is she saying that she's actually forgiven him? Likewise, there are two critical beats that happen here in the epilogue of the movie that are absolutely critical for Jim's development as a character. Number one, Jim actually apologizes with no excuses.
Aurora, I'm sorry. For everything.
Shut up, I'm coming.
I wish we'd have met in 90 years.
Number two is that Jim discovers that it's possible to put one of them back into hibernation, but only one of them. And so he says, "You're going back into hibernation. I will live alone." Now at that point, Aurora is well in her process of forgiving Jim. But it's not yet clear in the movie what choice she'll make. Will she eventually forgive him entirely and say, "I want to live with you, live out my life here on this ship"? Or is she going to go back to sleep? And so we're left with the very end of the movie where she makes that choice. So it was important to hit all of those beats. I don't think you can tell the story without them. I think at least the story is missing quite a bit if you try to tell it without them. However, the problem is that this epilogue is itself too long. I told you that in the original cut of the movie, it really feels like it changes tone here. And it feels like it's an entirely different movie throughout the rest of the end of it, and it doesn't really fit. Well, there's another break that happens right here after they've fixed the ship, and you've got the epilogue, and in an emotional sense, in a storytelling sense, you're well on the downslope, and you're kind of just feeling like, okay, let's get this movie over with. But we've got those critical character moments that have to happen in order to understand what's their long-term plan. So my last cut was very complex, where I took pieces all from Act 3 and did a whole bunch of cutting things out, and also a couple of different times where I took audio from one scene where somebody was saying something that was critical for the story, and video from some other scene that was telling something that was critical to understand the action. And you just turn them into a voiceover. And I was able to cut this epilogue down. I think it was 15 minutes in the original movie. I cut it down to something like 8 or 9 minutes. And now it flows a lot better. Does it work? It really does now work from a storytelling sense. It works a heck of a lot better than the original movie did. There's a number of cuts in here that are inelegant because I didn't have access to the original sources. And so sometimes you cut from one scene to another and you really feel a hard jump, either in the action or in the sound. I tried to minimize that as much as I could, but there were some places where I just couldn't avoid it. So it's not polished like a final movie would be. But from a storytelling sense, it really, really works a heck of a lot better now in the new version. So I'm going to end this video with a couple of my favorite clips from the new edit. I'm going to describe each of these clips, why they're significant, what the edit was, and then I'll show you at least bits and pieces of the new version. I would love to be able to share this version of Passengers with the world. Obviously, I can't for copyright reasons, but if you happen to know the people who have access to the copyrights, somebody who could actually give me permission to release this, I'd love to be able to release this out to the world. And now, for the last few minutes of this video, we're going to have some examples of the cool things you can do when you start intermixing the stories. The first one I want to tell you about is the spacesuit scenes. In the original movie, there are 2 spacesuit scenes that are separated by about 30 minutes. The first one is in Act 1. Jim is at the peak of his despair. He goes and he finds that there are spacesuits that he can borrow. He goes out into space and he weeps. And there's a real poignant moment where Jim reaches forward and touches the spacesuit, and you can just feel the depths of his loneliness as he just struggles for anything that approximates human contact. Then there's a second spacesuit scene, and this is when Jim and Aurora are falling in love. And so Jim takes Aurora out and gets to show her the beauty and the wonder of the stars. And the thing that had been so profoundly lonely for him now becomes a moment of profound joy. Now, in the original movie, of course, Act 1, the despair comes first, and then falling in love, Act 2, happens second, and they're separated by about 30 minutes. When you watch the movie, it's very obvious that one is a callback to another. That's not a surprise, but they are separated by quite a bit. But when you combine the two, when you interweave the two stories, you can now put these scenes next to each other. And so what I did is I actually swapped their order, first of all. We have the happy spacesuit scene followed by the sad spacesuit scene. But instead of being separated by 30 minutes, they're separated by about 3 minutes. And so now what happens is that while we've got this rising action of the story getting more and more interesting as time goes by, you're also experiencing a diverging experience of emotions. That you've got the happy emotions of falling in love and the sad emotions of despair are juxtaposed against each other and make each other more powerful for the comparison. Second, this is probably my favorite cut in the entire movie. This is one that I discovered very early when I started mixing things. Late in Act 2, Aurora is running around getting her exercise, and Jim wants to talk to her. She won't talk to him, and so he uses the PA to try to get her attention.
I was so alone for so long. It felt like I was disappearing. The night I first saw you, I was ready to... You saved my life. And I know that's no excuse for what I did.
He's trying to explain what was going on and why he felt so sad and why he felt like he had to do what he did. And the peak of that scene in the original cut is that she screams at him. We also have, in Act 1, the peak of Jim's despair. So right after Jim has gone out in the spacesuit, he then contemplates suicide, finally decides he's not going to commit suicide. Then that's the moment that he notices Aurora's pod, and he begins the process of falling in love with her in absentia. And that's eventually what's going to lead to him waking her up. What I found was really interesting was that Jim had a very important quote. He says that Aurora saved his life. And in his mind, he connects these things, that he was on the verge of suicide. And when he saw Aurora, that's when things changed. And so I took the audio from Act 2, used it as a voiceover onto the video from Act 1. Now the audio, this is another example of where, because I'm not working from original sources, it's not perfect. What you'll find there is that the audio quality changes because in Act 2, they're actually switching back and forth between two cameras. And so they put different audio filters on Jim's voice based on what you're seeing with the camera. I couldn't get rid of those audio filters. But if you excuse that, what you get is a really nice combination of the two scenes.
And I wish I could take it back. But I can't. Aurora.
Searching.
And finally, we have an example from the epilogue. Remember that I told you that the epilogue had to be really cut down, but there were some critical action moments and there were some critical spoken moments that had to all be communicated. In the original cut, Jim says, you're going to climb into the auto dock, you're going to go to sleep, you're going to wake up on Homestead 2. And then there's a pause where we contemplate this Jim's loneliness. And then we see Jim alone with Arthur, the bartender. And then at the very end, we have the last critical choice that Aurora had to make. The one that sews up the entire movie and guarantees that it comes away as a happy ending and not a sad, is that Aurora decides to stay with Jim, even though it means she's going to live just the two of them and die on board the ship. Well, we had to cover both of those points, but we didn't have to separate them by quite so much. And so I'll close this video with another example of how you can use voiceover over the top of video from a different part of the movie. In this case, all I've done is I've cut out 3 or 4 minutes at most. But I do really, really like the way the two scenes work so nicely together. It's Russ. I hope you've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed doing it. And I'll be seeing you later. Bye-bye.
You'd be alone.
I've been alone before, and I'll be fine.
But I would never see you again.
I'll come and visit you.
Tuesday's my day with Arthur.
Lovely as ever.
Thank you, Arthur. You're looking very well yourself.
Thanks to you.